Life had always been steady for me, predictable in the best way. Katrin and I had been married for 10 years, and while we weren't exactly the kind of couple you see in romance novels, we had a good rhythm. I thought we were solid. Our lives were built on routine, weekend hikes, occasional dinner parties, and evenings watching TV on the couch. I loved that life, even if it wasn't perfect. Maybe I loved it a bit too much to see what was really happening. The first sign that something was off came on a random Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was always pasta night. A silly tradition we started years ago. I came home from work with a bottle of wine to surprise her. Katrin wasn't in the kitchen like usual. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of her voice coming from the upstairs bedroom. She was on the phone. That wasn't unusual. Katrin loved to chat with her friends. But this was different. Her tone was softer, almost flirtatious. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about the way she ended the call, laughing lightly and saying, "Okay, you too. Bye," stuck with me. Who was she talking to? It wasn't her usual playful chatter with her best friend, Elena. When she came downstairs, I asked who she was on the phone with. She hesitated for just a second, then smiled. "Oh, just Elena. She's planning a trip, and we were going over details." I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. But that small hesitation, it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, little things started to pile up. Katrin began working late more often, claiming she had urgent deadlines. I'd always known her job at the marketing firm could be demanding, but she had never been this busy before. Then there were the text messages, her phone buzzing at odd hours of the night. Whenever I asked about them, she'd brush it off. "Work stuff," she'd say, or "Elena's being dramatic again." Once, I caught her smiling at her screen in a way that made my stomach twist. I asked her what was so funny, and she turned the screen off quickly, laughing nervously. "Just a meme Elena sent me," she replied, her voice a little too bright. I told myself I was being paranoid. Katrin had always been charismatic, the type of person who could light up a room. People were drawn to her energy. I had been too. But now that charm was starting to feel like a mask. One night, things took a turn. Katrin came home late, later than usual, and I noticed the faint smell of cologne on her clothes. Not mine. When I asked about it, she laughed it off. "Oh, we had a brainstorming session at the office, and the new guy sat a bit too close," she said, rolling her eyes. "Don't be jealous, Sergey. You know I'm yours." Her words felt hollow, and for the first time, I didn't laugh along. I started paying closer attention after that. I wasn't proud of it, but I began noticing patterns. Katrin was always working late on the same days, and she'd come home with the same faint smell of cologne. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her hand, the screen always tilted away from me. She even changed her passcode, a detail that didn't escape me. Then there was her demeanor. Katrin, who used to hum along to music while cooking or sneak up behind me with a playful kiss, was now distant. Distracted. She'd snap at me for small things, like forgetting to buy milk or leaving my shoes by the door. The warmth that had once defined our relationship felt like it was slipping away, replaced by a coldness I didn't recognize. One evening, I decided to test my instincts. Katrin had mentioned a late meeting again, so I called her office under the guise of needing to confirm something. Her assistant answered and sounded surprised. "Katrin. Oh, she left hours ago. Didn't she tell you?" No, she hadn't. That was the moment the doubts turned into something heavier. I sat on the couch that night, staring at the blank TV screen, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months. The late nights. The secret of phone calls. The smell of cologne. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth. But a voice in the back of my head told me to wait. To be sure. If Katrin was lying to me, if she was betraying me, I needed more than gut feelings. I needed proof. For now, I kept quiet, pretending everything was fine. But inside, something had shifted. My marriage, my home, the life I had built with Katrin, it no longer felt like solid ground. It felt like quicksand, pulling me deeper into uncertainty with every passing day. The following week was excruciating. Every smile Katrin flashed me felt like a dagger, every casual conversation a reminder of how much might be hidden beneath the surface. I couldn't stop replaying the moments that didn't add up. That lingering cologne. The phone she wouldn't leave unattended. The lies about working late. I decided to take a day off from work without telling Katrin. She thought I had an early meeting, so she kissed me on the cheek and left the house like any other morning. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys and followed her at a safe distance. My heart pounded as I drove, the rational part of me hoping this was all a mistake, that I'd find her at the office and feel like a fool for doubting her. But she didn't go to her office. Instead, Katrin pulled into the parking lot of a cafe on the edge of town, a place I didn't recognize. I parked a few spaces away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She got out of the car, glanced around nervously, then walked inside. I waited, debating whether to follow her. Every nerve in my body screamed for answers, but I was terrified of what I might find. Minutes stretched into an eternity before a man walked into the cafe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and far too familiar with my wife. I watched as Katrin greeted him with a smile that had once been reserved for me. A smile that was warm, inviting, and now utterly damning. They sat by the window, laughing and leaning in close. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The way she touched his hand, the way he looked at her, it told me everything. I pulled out my phone, snapping a few pictures from the car. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. My mind raced. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? Was this the reason for her late nights and secretive behavior? After about an hour, they stood to leave. I slouched lower in my seat, praying she wouldn't notice me. They walked out together, and I saw him place his hand on the small of her back as they laughed about something. My stomach churned as they got into separate cars and drove away. I stayed in the parking lot for a while, trying to process what I had just seen. My suspicions had been confirmed, but the pain of actually witnessing it was something I wasn't prepared for. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, leaving me stranded in a place I didn't recognize. When I got home, I didn't know how to act. Should I confront her? Demand answers? Part of me wanted to rage, to ask her how she could throw away everything we'd built together. But another part of me wanted to retreat, to let the truth settle before I made my move. I decided to wait. That night, Katrin came home cheerful, like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and told me about a stressful meeting at work. I nodded along, biting the inside of my cheek to stop myself from shouting. After dinner, while she was upstairs showering, I took her phone from the counter. My hands were trembling as I swiped through her messages. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Conversations with friends, family, co-workers. But then I found a contact saved under a generic name, Mark. The messages between them were brief but telling. Mark: can't stop thinking about today. Katrin: me neither. You looked so good. Can't wait for next time. My breath hitched. There it was, in plain text. Proof. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. But then I scrolled further. They had been meeting for months. The messages hinted at dinners, weekends when she'd claimed to be on business trips, even a hotel I recognized from a credit card statement I hadn't questioned at the time. My head was spinning as the reality of it all sank in. I took screenshots of the messages and emailed them to myself, careful not to leave any trace. By the time Katrin came downstairs, I had returned her phone to its usual spot and was sitting on the couch, trying to act normal. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head like she could sense something was off. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Long day." She nodded, kissed my forehead, and went to the kitchen to make tea. I watched her as she moved, so effortlessly confident in her lies. It hit me then how much she had underestimated me, how little she thought of my ability to uncover the truth. But now I had the truth, and I wasn't going to let her keep her secrets for much longer. The days after discovering Katrin's betrayal were the hardest of my life. Anger, sadness, and disbelief cycled through me like a storm I couldn't escape. Every time she smiled at me, every time she touched my arm, I had to stop myself from pulling away in disgust. But I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I was prepared. I spent my evenings researching. Betrayal was one thing. Protecting myself from its fallout was another. I learned quickly that emotions had no place in the cold world of divorce and infidelity. If Katrin wanted to ruin me financially or drag my name through the mud, I needed to ensure she wouldn't get the chance. The first step was finding the right lawyer. I reached out to a friend of a friend, someone I'd met at a dinner party who specialized in family law. The meeting was discreet. I told Katrin I had an early meeting at work, then drove across town to the lawyer's office. Her name was Anna, a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s who listened carefully as I explained my situation. When I showed her the evidence I had gathered, photos, screenshots of texts, her expression turned grim. "You've done well to document everything," she said. "This will be critical if things escalate. But Sergey, I need to be honest with you. If Katrin decides to fight, this could get messy." "I'll do whatever it takes," I replied, the words heavier than I expected. "I just want to protect myself, and the life I've built." Anna nodded. "Then let's start by securing your financial assets. Have you looked into your shared accounts?" I hadn't. Katrin handled most of the household finances, something I hadn't thought much about until now. That night, after she went to bed, I logged into our accounts and went through everything with a fine-tooth comb. What I found was worse than I expected. Over the past year, Katrin had been making significant withdrawals from our joint savings. Thousands of dollars were gone, siphoned off into an account I didn't recognize. My stomach sank as I stared at the numbers, wondering how I had missed this. The next day, I shared the information with Anna, who immediately advised me to freeze the account. "You need to act quickly," she said. "If she suspects you're onto her, she could drain what's left." Taking her advice, I went to the bank and initiated the process. I also opened a new account in my name only, transferring as much as I could without raising suspicion. It wasn't ideal. I knew Katrin would notice eventually, but it was a necessary risk. Meanwhile, I began gathering more evidence. I combed through old receipts, credit card statements, and emails, piecing together a timeline of her deception. Hotel stays, dinners, and purchases I hadn't questioned at the time now painted a clear picture. Katrin wasn't just having an affair. She was funding it with our money. The realization stung, but it also fueled me. Every new discovery hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about betrayal on every level. Katrin had taken my trust, my love, and my resources, and used them to build a life with someone else. She didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. In the middle of all this, I made an unexpected ally. Maria, my next-door neighbor. She had been a quiet presence in my life for years, someone I waved to in passing but never really knew. That changed when she noticed me pacing in my backyard one evening, visibly upset. "Sergey, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but genuine. I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about Maria's kindness broke through my defenses. I found myself opening up, telling her about Katrin's late nights and the doubts that had been eating away at me. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to unburden myself. Maria listened without judgment, offering quiet words of comfort. "You're stronger than you think," she said as we stood in the fading light. "And no matter what happens, you don't have to go through it alone." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Small, but enough to remind me that there was life beyond this mess. As the days turned into weeks, I continued my preparations. I updated the passwords to my email and bank accounts, ensuring Katrin couldn't access them. I started documenting her behavior, noting the nights she came home late and the excuses she gave. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. Through it all, I played the role of the oblivious husband. I kissed Katrin goodbye in the mornings, asked about her day, and pretended not to notice when she smiled at her phone during dinner. It wasn't easy. Every moment I spent with her felt like a betrayal of myself, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. Soon, I told myself. Soon, the lies would unravel, and Katrin would have no choice but to face the truth. Until then, I would wait. Quietly. Patiently. Strategically. It was a Friday night when everything came to a head. Katrin had another one of her late meetings, and I knew exactly where she was. I'd been tracking her for weeks, using every breadcrumb she left behind to piece together her lies. Tonight, she wasn't at the office. She was at a small boutique hotel downtown, the same one that had appeared on our credit card statements more than once. I parked down the street, far enough away to avoid being seen but close enough to watch the entrance. A part of me still hoped she wouldn't show, that maybe I had gotten it wrong somehow. But as the minutes ticked by, my hope dwindled. Around 7:30 p.m., Katrin's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, dressed to impress in a sleek black dress, her hair styled in a way she hadn't bothered with for our dates in years. My chest tightened as I watched her glance around nervously before heading inside. 10 minutes later, he arrived. The same man I'd seen at the cafe, the man she had been meeting behind my back. He entered the hotel without hesitation, as if this was routine for them. I waited another half hour, letting the rage simmer beneath the surface, then walked into the lobby. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I approached the desk. I asked for a specific room number, the one Katrin had booked under her maiden name. "Are you a guest?" the receptionist asked, her tone professional but wary. "I'm her husband," I replied, my voice calm but firm. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "They're in room 305. I took the elevator up, my heart pounding with every floor I passed. When I reached the door, I paused, taking a deep breath to steady myself. This wasn't just about catching her, it was about finally forcing her to face the reality of what she had done. I knocked. There was a long pause, followed by hushed voices on the other side. Then the door opened, and there she was. Katrin froze when she saw me, her face a mix of shock and fear. Behind her, the man stood awkwardly, his shirt half unbuttoned. "Sergey," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear it." I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. "You must be Mark," I said, my voice cold. "It's nice to finally meet you." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked to Katrin for guidance, but she was too stunned to speak. "You've been meeting here for months, haven't you?" I continued, my eyes never leaving hers. "Lying to me. Stealing from me. And for what? This." I gestured toward Mark, who flinched slightly. "Sergey, please," Katrin said finally, her voice trembling. "Let's talk about this at home." I laughed bitterly. "Talk? You want to talk now? After everything?" Katrin's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. Any sympathy I might have had for her was buried under the weight of her betrayal. "I know everything, Katrin," I said. "The messages. The hotel stays. The money you took from our savings to fund this little affair. I've been watching, documenting, preparing. And now it's over." Her tears turned to anger. "You were spying on me? That's sick, Sergey." "Spying?" I shot back. "No, Katrin. It's called protecting myself from the woman I thought I could trust. The woman who decided that sneaking around with him," I pointed at Mark, "was more important than her marriage." Mark cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I think I should go." "Yes," I interrupted. "I think you should." Without another word, Mark grabbed his jacket and slipped past me, leaving Katrin and me alone. The room was suffocatingly quiet. "How could you?" I finally asked, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. "How could you throw away everything we built together?" Katrin shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely, Sergey. You were always so focused on work, and I—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," I snapped, cutting her off. "I was building a life for us, Katrin. For you. And this is how you repay me." She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself, as if realizing there was no justification that would make this better. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, the words feeling both liberating and devastating. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. And trust me, Katrin, you won't be walking away from this unscathed." Her face crumpled, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of what she had done. But I didn't stay to watch her unravel. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in that hotel room, a room that would no longer be her secret sanctuary. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out now. The charade was over. And while the road ahead would be difficult, I knew one thing for certain: I was done being a victim. It was time to take my life back. The days following that confrontation were a whirlwind of tension and preparation. Katrin, unsurprisingly, swung between anger and desperation. She begged me to talk things through one moment, then accused me of being heartless and cruel the next. Her attempts to manipulate me no longer worked. I was too focused on what needed to be done. When I served her with divorce papers, the shock on her face was almost satisfying. "Almost. You're really doing this," she said, clutching the papers with trembling hands. "You gave me no choice," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "You made your decisions, Katrin. Now we both have to live with the consequences." Katrin's lawyer, some hotshot she likely couldn't afford, immediately tried to turn the tide in her favor. In her counterclaims, she painted me as a workaholic who neglected his wife, leaving her emotionally vulnerable. She even tried to justify the withdrawals from our savings, claiming they were necessary expenses for her personal growth. It was infuriating. But I was ready. Anna, my lawyer, was a fortress of composure as we dissected Katrin's claims. "This is textbook," she said during one of our meetings. "She's trying to play the victim to distract from the evidence against her. But the facts are on our side, Sergei. As long as we stick to them, we'll be fine." The court proceedings began with an air of hostility. Katrin arrived dressed to impress, her hair and makeup immaculate, as if she could charm the judge into siding with her. Mark wasn't there. Whether out of shame or fear, I didn't care. I sat across from her, my resolve hardening as the hearing unfolded. Anna presented our case meticulously, starting with the financial discrepancies. Bank statements, receipts, and even the email trail showing her unauthorized withdrawals painted a clear picture. Katrin's lawyer tried to argue that the money was spent on household needs, but Anna countered with evidence of hotel stays, expensive dinners, and gifts clearly unrelated to our marriage. The judge's expression turned grim as Anna laid everything bare. Then came the messages. The texts between Katrin and Mark left no room for interpretation. Her lawyer argued that these were private matters irrelevant to the division of assets, but Anna was ready. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "these messages are not just about infidelity. They establish a pattern of deception and misuse of marital resources, which directly impacts the financial claims my client is contesting." Katrin's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Katrin avoided my gaze, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the truth. As the hearing dragged on, it became clear that Katrin's attempts to discredit me were falling flat. I had been careful, calculated, and there was no evidence to support her claims of neglect or mistreatment. The judge seemed unimpressed with her theatrics and focused instead on the facts presented. By the time the ruling was issued, the tide had turned decisively in my favor. The court acknowledged the misuse of marital funds and awarded me the majority of our remaining assets. Katrin's request for spousal support was denied outright, citing her financial misconduct. She was left with little more than her personal belongings and a chance to rebuild her life, a life she had so recklessly jeopardized. As we left the courtroom, Katrin stopped me in the hallway. Her face was pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her eyes glistening with tears. I stared at her, searching for the woman I had once loved. But all I saw was someone I no longer recognized. "I didn't destroy this, Katrin," I said. "You did. I just refused to let you take me down with you." She looked away, and I walked past her without another word. The weight I had carried for months began to lift as I stepped outside. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the promise of change. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. But freedom came at a cost. The legal battle had drained me emotionally, and the wounds Katrin's betrayal left behind still stung. I knew healing wouldn't be immediate, But at least now I had the space to begin. That evening, as I sat in my now quiet house, I thought of Maria. She had been a steady presence through it all, offering quiet encouragement without prying. Maybe it was time to take her up on that coffee invitation she'd mentioned a few days ago. I wasn't ready for anything serious. Not yet. But I was ready to start rebuilding, one step at a time. And that, I realized, was enough. The days after the court ruling were a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I had won, but victory didn't feel like a celebration. The house was quieter now, the absence of Katrin's presence both a relief and a reminder of how much had been lost. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Maria stood there with her ever-present warm smile and a small casserole dish in her hands. "I thought you might not feel like cooking tonight," she said, holding the dish out to me. I couldn't help but smile back. "Maria, you're too kind. Come in." She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. It was the first time she'd been in the house since everything had happened, and I could see her taking it all in. The half-empty shelves, the faint traces of a life that had been turned upside down. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently as we sat at the table. I sighed, unsure of how to answer. "Better, I think. But some days are harder than others." She nodded, her expression understanding. "That's normal. Healing takes time, Sergey. You've been through a lot." As we ate, the conversation flowed easily, shifting from heavier topics to lighter ones. Maria had a way of putting people at ease, of making the world feel a little less overwhelming. She told me about her garden, the stray cat she had recently adopted, and the new project she was working on for her job. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. Really laughed. By the end of the evening, I felt lighter. As Maria got up to leave, I walked her to the door. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "For everything. You didn't have to do any of this, but it means a lot." She smiled, a hint of shyness in her eyes. "You're a good person, Sergey. You deserve kindness." After she left, I stood by the door for a long time, thinking about her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe, after everything, I deserved a little kindness. In the weeks that followed, Maria and I grew closer. It started small, running into each other at the grocery store, sharing a cup of coffee on her porch, but those moments began to add up. She became a quiet anchor in my life, someone who reminded me that not everything had to be so heavy. One evening, after helping her fix a broken fence in her backyard, we sat on her porch watching the sunset. The air was cool, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. "Do you ever think about starting over?" I asked, surprising even myself with the question. Maria tilted her head, considering. "I think about it all the time. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but starting over can be a good thing. It's scary, but it's also full of possibility." Her words stayed with me long after I went home. Starting over. It sounded terrifying, but also freeing. The shift in our relationship came unexpectedly, as most important moments do. One Saturday, I invited Maria and her cat-loving nephew, Max, over for a barbecue. It was casual, just burgers and laughter, but as the evening wore on, I realized how much her presence had changed things for me. As we cleared the table together, I turned to her, feeling a surge of courage. "Maria, I don't know where this is going, but I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're in my life." She looked up at me, her eyes soft and full of something I hadn't seen in a long time, trust. "Me too, Sergey," she said simply. That night, as I watched her walk back to her house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Maria and I weren't rushing into anything. We both knew the weight of past wounds and the importance of taking things slow. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a mutual respect that laid the foundation for something deeper. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking backward. I wasn't trapped in the betrayal, the lies, or the pain Katrin had left behind. I was looking forward, toward a future that, for the first time in a long time, felt bright. Maria wasn't just a glimmer of hope. She was proof that life could go on, that happiness was still possible, and that even in the aftermath of heartbreak, there was room for new beginnings. The divorce was finalized in early autumn, a crisp day that matched the sharp clarity I felt as I walked out of the courthouse. Katrin hadn't been there. Her lawyer had handled the final proceedings, and I hadn't minded the lack of her presence. It was cleaner this way. No lingering glances or half-hearted apologies. Just the final stamp on the dissolution of a life we once shared. The ruling was overwhelmingly in my favor. The court had seen through her manipulations and lies, and she had little left to stand on. I walked away with the house, my assets secure, and the assurance that Katrin wouldn't be able to take more from me than she already had. That night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of whiskey, letting the weight of it all settle. For months, my life had been a constant churn of tension and strategy, driven by the need to protect myself. Now, it was over. I felt lighter, but not completely free. The scars of betrayal didn't disappear just because the paperwork was signed. Memories of Katrin lingered in the house. In the photos I'd already boxed away, in the faint smell of her perfume that seemed to cling to the curtains. It wasn't just the house, though. It was the emotional residue of someone I had once trusted, someone I thought would walk through life with me. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs. It was time to reclaim what was mine, not just the house, but my peace. Maria came by the next morning with coffee and a smile, as if sensing I needed company. She didn't bring up the divorce unless I did, letting the conversation flow naturally as we sat at the kitchen table. "You seem different today," she said after a while, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Different how?" I asked, sipping the coffee she'd brought. "Freer," she said simply. I nodded, realizing she was right. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel trapped in my own life. We spent the rest of the day cleaning out the house, tackling rooms I hadn't touched in months. Maria worked alongside me, boxing up the remnants of my old life without hesitation. It wasn't just practical. It felt symbolic. Each item we packed away was a step closer to starting fresh. When we finally called it a day, the house felt different, lighter, like it was no longer haunted by the past. The next few weeks were a blur of change. I updated the house, repainting walls that felt too tied to old memories and replacing furniture that no longer suited me. Maria helped, of course, her practical suggestions balanced by her knack for making a space feel warm and inviting. One evening, as we stood in the newly painted living room, she looked around and smiled. "It feels like yours now," she said. "It is mine," I replied, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. It wasn't just the house that was changing. I was changing, too. The town had its share of gossip, of course. News of the divorce had spread, and Katrin's reputation was far from intact. I tried not to dwell on what people were saying, about her, about me, about the affair that had unraveled everything. It wasn't my business anymore. Maria, on the other hand, was quickly becoming a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. We weren't a couple, at least, not officially. But there was a quiet intimacy in the way she made herself at home in my space, the way she noticed the small things I needed before I even said them out loud. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, almost as if she was reassuring herself as much as me. "I think I already am," I replied, and for the first time, I believed it. By the time winter rolled around, life felt steady again. The house was mine, not just in name but in spirit. My days were filled with work and small projects, and my evenings often included Maria, whether it was dinner at her place or quiet conversations on my porch. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just about being rid of Katrin. It was about rediscovering myself, what I wanted, what made me happy, and what kind of life I wanted to build moving forward. Maria was becoming part of that life, but this time I was in no rush. I wasn't looking for someone to fill the void Katrin had left. I was looking for someone who added to the life I was creating, and Maria did that effortlessly. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control, not of anyone else, but of myself. My choices, my happiness, my future. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Spring arrived quietly, its warmth sneaking in to melt the last traces of winter. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm, one I hadn't known I could have. The past was still there, of course, its lessons, its scars, but it no longer dictated my every thought. Maria and I grew closer in ways that felt natural and unforced. There was no need to rush, no pressure to define what we were. We simply fit into each other's lives, our moments together a source of comfort and joy. One Saturday, as we planted flowers in her garden, she turned to me, wiping dirt from her hands. "You've changed so much since last year," she said, her voice filled with admiration. I laughed softly. You think so? She nodded. You're lighter. Happier. Like you've found yourself again. Her words stayed with me, and that evening, as we sat on my porch watching the stars, I realized how true they were. The Sergei who had been broken and lost in the wake of Katrin's betrayal was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who had learned how to let go. The defining moment of this new chapter came on a sunny afternoon when Maria invited me to join her for a picnic by the lake. She packed sandwiches and fruit, and we spent hours talking and laughing under the shade of an old oak tree. At one point, as we watched the water ripple in the breeze, she reached for my hand. I know you're still healing, she said softly, but I need you to know something. I turned to her, my heart beating a little faster. I care about you, Sergei. A lot. And I'm willing to take this as slow as you need. But I want us to have a chance. Her honesty caught me off guard, but in the best way. Maria had been my anchor through the storm, and now she was offering me something more. Something I wasn't sure I deserved but desperately wanted. I want that too, I said, squeezing her hand. The smile she gave me then was one I'd never forget. It wasn't just a smile, it was hope, trust, and the promise of something new. Our relationship blossomed in the weeks that followed, each moment building on the last. Maria's kindness and patience were a constant reminder that love didn't have to be complicated or painful. It could be simple, steady, and beautiful. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in her kitchen, she paused and looked at me with a mischievous grin. What? I asked, laughing. You're happier now than I've ever seen you, she said, her eyes sparkling. And I think I might have something to do with that. I pulled her into a hug, her laughter muffled against my chest. You have everything to do with that, I said. By the time summer rolled around, Maria and I were inseparable. We spent lazy afternoons at the lake, quiet evenings on the porch, and weekends exploring the little towns nearby. One night, as we sat under the stars, Maria rested her head on my shoulder. Do you ever think about the future? She asked. All the time, I replied. And what do you see? I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. I see us building a life together, maybe traveling, maybe even starting a family someday. Her hand tightened around mine. That sounds perfect. It did. For the first time in years, the future felt like something to look forward to, not something to fear. The story of Katrin and her betrayal would always be a part of my past, but it no longer defined me. It had taught me lessons I didn't want but desperately needed, about resilience, self-worth, and the strength to start over. Maria was proof that starting over was possible, that even in the aftermath of heartbreak, there was room for something beautiful. As we stood on my porch one evening, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I realized just how far I'd come. This was my new chapter, my new beginning. And with Maria by my side, I knew it would be a story worth living.